In 1903, a French colonial survey team crossed the central Sahara Desert and recorded something that should not have been there. They wrote down rivers. They sketched the outlines of forests. They noted evidence of permanent, large-scale agricultural infrastructure stretching across regions that today are among the most lifeless places on the surface of the earth. Their report was submitted, reviewed, and scheduled for full publication by the French Geographic Society. Then, it was quietly pulled. The lead surveyor's name was scrubbed from the primary index. The full document was reclassified and buried in an archive subsection that required a specific institutional clearance to access. Most researchers never knew it existed. The abbreviated version that did circulate removed every reference to vegetation, water, and habitation evidence. What remained was a dry logistics report about sand elevation and camel routes. That is not an edited document, that is a replacement document. And the reason that matters is not because of one survey. It matters because of what was already known before that survey team ever left Paris, and what the colonial geographic establishment spent the better part of 60 years trying to make sure the public never connected together. If this is your first time on this channel, subscribe now and hit the bell. We go places the algorithm does not want us to go, and you are not going to want to miss what comes next. The Sahara Desert today covers approximately 9 million square kilometers. It stretches from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania in the west to the Red Sea in the east, and from the Mediterranean coastline in the north to the Sahel transition zone in the south. It is the largest hot desert on Earth. It receives, on average, less than 25 millimeters of rainfall per year across most of its interior. In the central Taners Roof Basin, that number drops to essentially zero. There are regions of the Sahara where no measurable precipitation has been recorded in living memory. It is, by every conventional metric, one of the most hostile environments for complex biological life that exists on this planet. And yet the geological record tells a completely different story. The Sahara has a documented wet phase. Scientists call it the African humid period, or informally the Green Sahara. The mainstream academic consensus holds that this period ended approximately 5,000 years ago, give or take several centuries, depending on the regional dataset being analyzed. During this period, the Sahara supported lakes, river systems, grasslands, woodland corridors, and large fauna populations, including hippos, crocodiles, and elephants in regions that are now nothing but gravel and cracked clay. Petroglyphs carved into rock formations deep in the Algerian and Libyan interiors show giraffe, cattle, and human figures in boats. The rock art exists. The bone deposits exist. The ancient lake beds exist. The scientific community does not dispute any of this. What they dispute, with remarkable consistency, is the end point. Because here is the problem. If the Green Sahara ended 5,000 years ago, then the landscape had thousands of years to fully desiccate before any European explorer, colonial surveyor, or geographic society ever set foot in the interior. The narrative is clean. Ancient wet period, gradual drying, complete desert by the time anyone was writing it down. But the 1903 survey report, and a cluster of other documents surrounding it, suggests the timeline is not clean at all. The survey in question was led by a military geographic officer operating under the authority of the French Ministry of Colonies, which by 1903 was aggressively extending administrative control into the deep Saharan interior following the conquest of the Algerian highlands in the mid-1800s. France needed accurate maps, not political maps, but terrain maps. River crossings, elevation gradients, soil composition, vegetation lines, water table indicators. The kind of information an army and a colonial administration needs to move people, goods, and infrastructure across a continent. So they sent trained surveyors with instruments, with notebooks, and with standing orders to record what they actually found, not what the maps already said was there. What the lead surveyor recorded in the central Algerian Sahara, in the regions south and southwest of the Ahaga Mountains, was evidence of what he described in his field notes as a recently desiccated fluvial network. Recently. Not ancient, not geological. Recent. He noted riverbeds with intact bank structures that had not yet eroded into the surrounding terrain. He noted root systems of large trees preserved in clay deposits at a depth consistent with topsoil, not deep geological strata. He noted terraced hillside formations that he explicitly flagged as potentially artificial, consistent with agricultural water management infrastructure. He noted standing stone structures at intervals along what appeared to be a former watercourse, spaced in a pattern that suggested deliberate human placement rather than natural deposition. He also noted, in the section of his field report dealing with local oral testimony, that the Tuareg guides accompanying the survey spoke of a time within the memory of their grandfathers when the region had permanent water and seasonal green cover. Not a mythological era, not a creation story. Grandfathers. Living memory, 1 or 2 generations removed. That would place the transition within the window of the mid to late 1800s at the absolute earliest, or possibly more recently than that. The full report was submitted to Paris in late 1903. It was received, catalogued, and assigned a publication reference number in the French Geographic Society's 1904 schedule. Then, between late 1903 and early 1904, something happened in the administrative chain. The publication was postponed. Then it was revised. Then the revised version was the one that circulated, and the original was transferred to a restricted subsection of the colonial archive. The lead surveyor was reassigned to a mapping project in Madagascar and does not appear in any further Saharan geographic literature. His name, when it appears at all in later academic citations, is cited only for the abbreviated logistics version, never for the original field report. This would be a minor historical footnote if it were an isolated incident. It is not isolated. It is part of a pattern that runs through European colonial geographic literature from roughly 1840 to 1920, and once you know what you are looking at, you start seeing it in documents that have been sitting in plain sight for over a century. In 1850, the German explorer Heinrich Barth crossed the Sahara from Tripoli to Lake Chad and kept meticulous journals later published in English translation. In the Fezzan region of what is now southern Libya, Barth describes ancient irrigation channels carved into bedrock, clearly not natural formations. He describes ruins of a settled civilization at multiple locations, ruins that included worked stone, enclosed courtyards, and reservoir structures. He estimated from the erosion patterns that these structures had been abandoned within the previous few centuries, not millennia. His journals were published. But in the academic literature that followed, Barth's observations about the age of the ruins were consistently reframed. The structures were described as ancient, Bronze Age, prehistoric. The question of how recently they were in use was quietly moved off the table. The Garamantians are worth pausing on. Their civilization occupied the Fezzan region from roughly 500 BCE to 700 CE by mainstream dating. They built a hydraulic infrastructure system called the Foggara, thousands of kilometers of underground channels that tapped subsurface water and directed it to the surface for agriculture. The mainstream interpretation holds that they exploited a fossil water source until it ran out. Their civilization collapsed around the 7th century CE, and the region was already ruins by the time Arab geographers arrived. That is the official story, and it has a serious problem. Arab geographers in the 9th and 10th centuries were not describing a lifeless desert. They were describing inhabited towns, trade routes with functioning infrastructure, and in some cases vegetation and water sources that do not exist today. The transition from what those Arab accounts describe to what European explorers found in the 1800s is sharper than a 1500-year gradual drying would predict. Something happened between the medieval Arab record and the 19th century European arrival, and the conventional timeline does not explain it. This is where the Tartarian framework becomes relevant, not as a label for a specific empire or dynasty, but as a framework for understanding a global civilization that was functioning at a high level of complexity until a catastrophic disruption within the last few centuries erased or severely damaged it across enormous geographic areas. Simultaneously, the Saharan evidence is consistent with that framework in ways that are difficult to explain through the conventional narrative. Consider the infrastructure scale. The Foggara channel systems in the Fezzan alone represent tens of thousands of hours of organized, coordinated labor operating with precise knowledge of subsurface hydrology. This required survey capability, engineering knowledge, and an administrative system sophisticated enough to coordinate labor across a landscape without modern roads. The mainstream answer is the Garamantians. But if their infrastructure had been abandoned for 1,000 years in the Sahara, exposed to wind and sand, it would not look recently desiccated. It would not produce root system preservation consistent with topsoil deposition. It would not generate oral testimony about grandfathers who remembered permanent water. The 1903 surveyor was not looking at ancient ruins. He was looking at something much more recent. And the institution that received his report knew it. There is another layer that rarely gets discussed, involving the cartographic record itself. Maps of the Sahara, produced before approximately 1850, are inconsistent with each other in ways that suggest the map makers were working from fundamentally different source information. Several pre-1800 European maps show river systems in regions that are currently hyperarid, not as speculation or legend, but as geographic features drawn with the same confidence as the coastline. The argument that these were simply errors repeated from classical sources does not hold up. Classical Greco-Roman sources do describe interior Saharan rivers, but the pre-1800 European maps do not simply repeat those errors. In some cases, they show different systems with different courses. They are not copying ancient mistakes. They are drawing from sources that independently corroborate water in regions we now call desert. When the French colonial survey apparatus mapped the Saharan interior from the 1840s onward, those older cartographic traditions did not get reconciled with the new data. They got retired. The maps that emerged from the colonial geographic institutions were authoritative and showed a desert. Whatever the older tradition was drawing from was treated as error rather than evidence. Now return to the 1903 report. A French colonial surveyor goes into the Central Sahara with instruments and standing orders to record what he finds. He records root systems at topsoil depth. He records bank structures that have not yet eroded. He records standing stone infrastructure at deliberate intervals. He records oral testimony, placing the transition within living memory. He submits his report. It is pulled. He disappears from the literature. The institution that pulled the report was not staffed by stupid people. The French Geographic Society in 1903 was one of the most technically sophisticated geographic institutions in the world. They understood what recently desiccated meant. They understood what topsoil depth root preservation implied about the timeline. They understood what oral testimony one generation removed from a landscape transition meant for the conventional history of the Sahara. They pulled the report because they understood it, not because they failed to understand it. The question the conventional framework never satisfactorily answers is why. Why would a colonial geographic institution suppress evidence of a recently active Saharan landscape? The obvious answer is that the timeline implied by the evidence was incompatible with something the institution needed to protect, not a colonial political interest. France had no particular political reason to hide trees and rivers in Algeria. What needed protecting was the foundational chronology. If the Sahara was green within living memory of people the surveyor interviewed in 1903, then the consensus history of the region is wrong by a very large margin. And if that timeline is wrong, then the entire framework of how we understand the pace and nature of civilizational collapse is open to revision. The Tartarian interpretation holds that a global civilizational disruption occurred within the last few centuries, an event or series of events that collapsed complex infrastructure, reshaped landscapes, and was papered over by the institutions that emerged in the aftermath. The Saharan evidence does not prove that interpretation, but it is consistent with it in a way the conventional timeline is not. A landscape that desiccated 5,000 years ago does not produce a 1903 survey report describing recently abandoned riverbeds. A landscape that was green within living memory does. There are researchers in desert geomorphology today who publish findings that brush against this problem without engaging it directly. Studies of dust deposition rates, lake sediment cores, and highland vegetation refugia keep producing data points that strain the conventional timeline. The rock art dates get pushed. The wet period endpoints get extended. The Foggara abandonment dates get revised. Each revision moves the evidence slightly closer to the present without anyone asking the obvious question of where the movement ends. It ends, if the 1903 survey is taken seriously, within the window of the modern historical record. It ends in a place where there were people alive who remembered Green Sahara, who told their grandchildren, whose grandchildren told a French survey officer in 1903, whose testimony was then classified and buried. What we are left with is the shape of the suppression, the abbreviated document that replaced the original, the surveyor who vanished from the literature, the pattern of parallel erasures across colonial geographic institutions across the same decades, and the geological data that keeps insisting the desert is younger than the textbook says. Institutions do not reclassify, replace, and bury documents that contain nothing important. The effort invested in removing something from the record is proportional to the threat it poses to the record being maintained. The 1903 French Sahara Survey posed a very serious threat. The people who received it knew that immediately. And the world they built on top of that buried document is the world you were taught to accept as history. The archive is not empty, it is locked, and there is a significant difference between the two. If you found this video useful, share it with someone who asks questions the mainstream does not want asked. Drop a comment below and tell me what part of the official Sahara timeline you have always found unconvincing. I read everything. Subscribe if you are not already here, because the next video goes deeper into the cartographic erasure and what the pre-colonial maps were actually drawing from. You do not want to miss that one.